My wife's husband called me an ATM and stole money from my family, but when I took him to court, he lost everything. I always knew my family had a weird dynamic, but I never thought they'd straight up humiliate me like that. I mean, sure, I've always been the successful one, the one who went to college, built a business, bought a house, did all the things that were supposed to make you respected in a family. But apparently, success just made me the family ATM. Trevor, my brother-in-law, has been a parasite for years. He borrows money, never pays it back, and somehow always finds a way to use my stuff without asking. My car, my tools, even my vacation home once. He just acts like everything I have is up for grabs. I put up with it for the sake of my sister, Emily. She married him, and I didn't want to make things harder for her. But this one night at my mother's house changed everything. We were all gathered for dinner. My mom, Emily, Trevor, and a few cousins. My mom had cooked one of her classic Sunday meals, the kind that made me nostalgic for when I was a kid. Roast beef, mashed potatoes, a side of green beans that no one really touched. I had just bought a brand new electric car, something I'd worked my ass off for, and I was excited about it. It was sleek, efficient, and, most importantly, mine. But of course, I wasn't the only one interested. At some point during dinner, I heard the unmistakable sound of a car door closing outside. I glanced out the window, and there he was, Trevor, sliding into the driver's seat of my car like he owned it. His feet were up on the dashboard, and he had this smug grin on his face as he ran his hands over the wheel. I clenched my jaw and stood up. Is Trevor seriously in my car right now? Before I could even make it to the door, he called out loud enough for everyone to hear. Yo, Ethan, you're not a real man. You're just a walking ATM. And then, this is the part that hit me. Everyone at the table laughed. My mom, my sister, my cousins. Like it was the funniest joke they'd ever heard. I just stood there, staring at them. They didn't realize I was pissed. Or maybe they did and just didn't care. My mother wiped a tear from her eye, still chuckling, while Emily just shook her head with an amused smile. Like this was normal. Like this was just Trevor being Trevor. I walked outside, my fists clenched at my sides. Get out of my car, I said, my voice sharp. Trevor, still lounging like he had all the time in the world, gave me a lazy grin. Relax, bro. It's just a joke. I opened the door and stepped closer. I said, get out. For a second, I saw something flicker in his eyes. Maybe it was the realization that I wasn't playing along this time. He raised his hands in mock surrender and slid out of the car, laughing. Damn, man. You take everything so seriously. I ignored him, brushing past to check the interior. He'd left a smudge on the touchscreen, and it pissed me off more than it should have. Back inside, I expected anyone, to say something. Maybe a hey, Trevor, that was out of line, or even a weak sorry. Instead, my mom sighed like I was the one making a scene. Oh, Ethan, lighten up. You know how Trevor is. Yeah, I said, my voice flat. I do. Dinner continued as if nothing had happened. The conversation moved on to something about a neighbor's divorce, then the latest football scores, but I wasn't listening. I kept looking at my mom, my sister, my family, people I thought respected me, but all I could hear was their laughter echoing in my head. That's when it hit me. They didn't respect me. They didn't see me as one of them. I was just a resource, a bank account with a heartbeat. The rest of the evening passed in a blur. I ate in silence, pushing my food around my plate, nodding at the right times, but not really engaging. My mom noticed my mood and rolled her eyes, as if I were some moody teenager instead of a grown man who had just been humiliated in front of his own family. When dinner was finally over, I left without saying much. As I walked to my car, I heard Trevor chuckling behind me. See you later, big guy. Don't spend all our money at once. I gripped the steering wheel so tightly on the way home that my knuckles turned white. That night, I lay awake in bed, replaying everything. The laughter, the dismissiveness, the way my own mother had acted like my feelings didn't matter. It wasn't just Trevor. It was all of them. And for the first time, I realized I wasn't going to be their ATM anymore. The moment I left my mother's house, I knew I wasn't coming back. Not like before. Not as their reliable, generous, ever-accommodating Ethan. I had been humiliated in front of my own family, reduced to nothing more than an ATM, a source of wealth they all felt entitled to. And Trevor, the leech, had been the one to say it out loud. But I wasn't going to yell or argue or demand respect from people who clearly didn't see me as an equal. I was going to make sure they never saw me as their personal cash cow again. I ordered a rideshare instead of driving home in my own car. I didn't trust Trevor, and I wasn't about to leave an opportunity for him to find some excuse to borrow it while I was inside stewing over the night's events. The moment I got into the back seat of the rideshare, I pulled out my phone, navigated to my car's remote access app, and disabled the vehicle entirely. If Trevor had even entertained the idea of taking it for a spin, he was in for a surprise when he realized it wouldn't even turn on. It was a small act of control, but it gave me a surge of satisfaction. Still, that didn't fix the real problem. The laughter, the complete disregard for my dignity, the way my own mother had brushed off Trevor's behavior like I was the one overreacting. It all sat in my chest like a heavy weight. But what stuck with me the most was the way Trevor had spoken about me. His words hadn't been a joke. There had been a smugness to them, a confidence, as if he knew something I didn't. He acted like my money was his. That thought made my stomach twist, and suddenly, I felt the overwhelming need to check my finances. I had always been careful with money, always ensured my bills were paid, my accounts balanced, my investments growing. But I had also been too trusting, too willing to assume that just because I was careful, others couldn't find ways to exploit me. As the rideshare driver took me through the dimly lit streets, I opened my banking app and started scanning through my accounts. Nothing seemed off at first. Balances were what they should be, transactions looked normal, but something in my gut told me to dig deeper. I pulled up my credit report, something I hadn't checked in months because I had no reason to. And that's when I saw it. For loans. 3 credit cards. All opened in my name. All maxed out. For a moment, I just stared at the screen, the numbers blurring together. This wasn't some minor mistake. This was deliberate. Someone had used my name, my credit, my reputation, and saddled me with thousands of dollars of debt. And there was only one person in my life shameless enough to pull something like this, Trevor. I clicked on the details, scanning for any indication of where these debts had been funneled. Sure enough, the billing address tied to them wasn't mine. It was for some dingy apartment complex across town. I had never lived there, never even set foot in the place. But I had a damn good guess as to who had. My heart pounded in my chest, but I forced myself to breathe evenly. This was no longer just about a humiliating dinner. This was fraud. This was theft. Trevor had been bleeding me dry in ways I hadn't even realized, and all while my own family had laughed along with him. I pulled up my contacts and called my lawyer. He picked up groggily, his voice thick with sleep. Ethan, do you have any idea what time? I need you to look into something for me. I cut in, my voice cold. Someone's been taking out loans in my name. I want to know exactly what I can do legally. There was a long pause on the other end, then a sigh. That's serious. Send me everything you got. I'll take a look and call you back. Make it fast, I said before ending the call. By the time I arrived home, I felt like a different person. The naive Ethan who had tolerated Trevor's bullshit, who had swallowed his family's disrespect, who had let things slide for the sake of keeping the peace, that Ethan was gone. I wasn't just going to stop Trevor. I was going to make sure he paid for every cent he stole. I barely slept that night, not because I was unsure of what I was going to do, but because every time I closed my eyes, I replayed the moment Trevor had smirked at me from the driver's seat of my own car, the way my mother had laughed along with everyone else, as if my entire existence had been reduced to nothing more than a walking ATM for the people who were supposed to care about me. But there was no use dwelling on that now. The moment I had seen the fraudulent loans in my name, the stolen money, the credit cards I never applied for, something inside me had snapped. I had spent years being the responsible one, the provider, the successful sibling who never asked for anything, who never expected gratitude, and yet, instead of respect, all I had gotten was exploitation disguised as family loyalty. Well, I was done playing their game, and by the time I was finished, Trevor was going to wish he had never crossed me. At dawn, while the rest of the world was still waking up, I was already on my laptop, making sure Trevor's easy life came to an abrupt and painful halt. The first thing I did was contact my bank and freeze every account I had, ensuring that no more money could mysteriously vanish without my knowledge. My credit cards were next. I called each company, reported fraudulent activity, canceled everything under my name that I hadn't personally opened, and requested new security measures to prevent unauthorized transactions. But I didn't stop there. With a few more calls, I locked my credit entirely, filing disputes on every fraudulent loan and providing documentation proving I had never lived at the address tied to them. By the time I finished, Trevor's entire financial pipeline had been cut off, and there wasn't a damn thing he could do about it. It didn't take long for the fallout to begin. By mid-morning, my phone started buzzing, first with a string of text messages from my sister Melanie, who had apparently been woken up by Trevor's tantrum. She demanded to know why he suddenly couldn't access his bank accounts, why his credit cards were getting declined, why his Venmo transactions weren't going through, and why I was acting like this over a stupid joke. I didn't even bother responding. A few hours later, she called, and when I didn't pick up, she left a voicemail, her voice sharp with irritation as she accused me of going too far and overreacting, before ending with the words that made my blood boil. "You're tearing this family apart?" I listened to that message twice, letting the sheer audacity of it sink in, before deleting it and putting my phone on silent. It was almost comical how quickly the tables had turned. For years, I had been expected to be the reasonable one, the generous one, the one who forgave and forgot. But the moment I stopped enabling their behavior, suddenly, I was the villain. Trevor wasn't panicking because he was sorry for what he had done. He was panicking because his free ride had ended, and he had no idea how to function without someone else's money keeping him afloat. Melanie wasn't upset because she genuinely believed I had done something wrong. She was upset because she had hitched her life to a leech, and now she was facing the consequences of that choice. And as for my mother, well, I had no doubt she'd find some way to make this all my fault too, but I no longer cared. For the first time in years, I wasn't worried about keeping the peace, about making sure everyone else was comfortable at my own expense. I had spent too long being their safety net, their emergency fund, their convenient solution to every financial mistake they made. And the only thing I had ever gotten in return was laughter at my expense. But that was over now, and as I sat back in my chair, watching the messages pile up on my phone without an ounce of guilt, I realized something I should have understood a long time ago. I wasn't the one tearing this family apart. I was just the first one to stop pretending it hadn't been broken all along. I had thought I had uncovered the worst of it, that cutting off Trevor's access to my money and exposing his fraudulent loans was the full extent of the damage he had done. But life has a way of proving that. When you think you've hit rock bottom with family betrayal, there's always another layer of deceit waiting underneath. It started with Mila. My girlfriend had always been more suspicious of my family's behavior than I was, but I had dismissed it for years, making excuses, telling her that Trevor was just irresponsible, that my mother was just trying to keep the peace, that my sister was stuck in a bad situation. But after what had happened at dinner, she was just as furious as I was, and unlike me, she wasn't going to let emotions cloud her logic. "Something isn't adding up," she said that morning as she sat on my couch, scrolling through her laptop with a sharp, determined expression. "If Trevor had access to that much money through you, why was he still always asking for cash? Where was it going?" I hadn't really considered that. I had assumed he was just an idiot who burned through money the moment it touched his hands, but Mila was right. There had to be a reason why he was constantly broke despite the fraudulent credit cards, the loans, and whatever cash he had managed to squeeze out of me over the years. That's when she found it. I had a vacation home upstate, a small but beautiful cabin near the lake, something I had bought a few years ago as a quiet getaway from work. I didn't visit it often, maybe a few times a year, and I had assumed it was just sitting there, untouched, waiting for whenever I needed it. But when Mila did a quick search of short-term rental listings, she found something that made my blood turn to ice. There it was. My cabin. Trevor had been renting it out. The listing didn't use my name, of course. It was under some nonsense company name, but the pictures? The furniture? The amenities? It was mine. He had been running a rental business using my property, collecting thousands of dollars in bookings while I had been completely unaware. I sat there staring at the screen, my hands clenched into fists, as Mila scrolled through reviews from people who had stayed there. They had paid Trevor to use my home, and he had kept every cent. I wasn't even angry anymore. I was past that. There was something worse than anger building inside me. A kind of cold, calculating fury that made me want to be absolutely sure that when I took him down, there wouldn't be a single scrap left for him to crawl back to. But the worst discovery was still to come. While I was still processing the sheer audacity of what Trevor had done, my lawyer called me back. I expected him to confirm what I already knew, that I could press charges for fraud, that I had a strong case to report him for identity theft. Instead, he asked me something that caught me completely off guard. "Did you know your mother took out a second mortgage on her house?" I blinked. "What?" "There's a loan under her name from last year, about $50,000. It's not connected to you, but I figured you'd want to know. It looks like it was paid out to a joint account, but the other name on it isn't hers, it's Trevor's." I sat there, stunned. My mother, who had never had financial troubles in her life, who had owned her home outright for years, had taken out a mortgage and given the money to Trevor. I felt sick. All these years, I had assumed she just ignored his behavior, that she was just another enabler who didn't want to rock the boat. But this meant she had actively participated in his mess. Whether she had done it willingly or whether Trevor had manipulated her into it, I didn't know yet. But either way, she had put herself in financial jeopardy for him while standing by and laughing at me for refusing to be used. It was like the entire foundation of what I had believed about my family had been ripped away. Mila watched me carefully, waiting for my reaction, probably expecting me to lash out, to throw something, to scream. But I didn't. I just sat there, my mind racing through everything I needed to do next. Trevor had taken more from me than I had even realized, and now, he had dragged my mother into his mess. Whether she had been complicit or just gullible didn't matter anymore. All that mattered was that he was going to pay for every last bit of it. I thought I had uncovered everything. I thought the fraudulent loans, the stolen money, the vacation home scam, and the second mortgage were the full extent of Trevor's destruction. But once I started pulling at the threads, I realized that what I had uncovered was just the beginning. Trevor hadn't just been leeching off me. He hadn't just manipulated my mother into putting her house on the line. He had been scamming our entire family. The realization came in pieces. After hearing about my mother's second mortgage, I started wondering just how deep Trevor's deception really went. If he had convinced my mother, who had once prided herself on never owing a dime to anyone, to take out a loan, who else had he gotten to? I started making phone calls, reaching out to family members, asking indirect questions at first. The responses were a mix of confusion, hesitation, and, in some cases, immediate defensiveness. But one by one, the pieces started falling into place. First, I called my Uncle David, my mom's older brother, a man who had always been cautious with money. He sounded wary the moment he picked up, like he already knew why I was calling. When I asked if he had lent Trevor money, there was a long pause before he sighed. Not just lent, he admitted. He convinced me to co-sign a loan for him last year. Said he needed it to get back on his feet. I figured with your success, if anything went wrong, you'd probably help him out. But now I'm stuck with payments he hasn't made in months. The words hit me like a slap. I had never agreed to anything like that, never given Trevor permission to use my name or my success as a safety net. And yet, he had gone around telling people that if things got bad, I'd bail him out, that I was so wealthy I wouldn't even notice if he left behind a trail of unpaid debts. It got worse from there. My cousin Andrew had loaned Trevor $5,000, believing some sob story about needing to cover medical expenses. My Aunt Linda had given him money for legal trouble, which I now suspected had nothing to do with actual lawyers. Even my grandmother, had been manipulated into giving him money for what he had claimed was a business investment. I was no longer angry. I was disgusted. The worst part wasn't even the money itself. It was the fact that he had used me as leverage. Everyone I talked to had some variation of the same reasoning. I figured Ethan wouldn't let him fail, or I assumed if things went bad, you'd step in. Trevor had built an entire empire of deception based on the assumption that I would always clean up his mess. He had borrowed money, forged documents, and manipulated our relatives, all while knowing that if he got caught, I'd be the one people blamed for letting him spiral. That was the moment I knew there was no salvaging this. I wasn't just going to cut him off. I was going to make sure he couldn't do this to anyone else ever again. That afternoon, I gathered every single document, every fraudulent account, every unpaid loan, every manipulated family member's statement, and I handed everything over to my lawyer. I want to go after him with everything we have, I told him, my voice cold. Identity theft, fraud, forgery, anything you can find. I don't care how long it takes. I want him held accountable. My lawyer, a man who had seen plenty of financial betrayals in his time, nodded slowly, flipping through the stack of evidence with an expression of grim satisfaction. He's going to prison, he said simply. And for the first time in years, I felt a sense of relief. The fallout didn't take long to begin. Once the legal gears started turning, the dominoes fell one by one, and the weight of Trevor's actions came crashing down on everyone who had believed in him. He had spent years weaving an intricate web of lies, relying on my family's blind faith and my financial stability to keep himself afloat. But the moment I pulled the rug out from under him, the entire house of cards collapsed. The first and most devastating blow came to my mother. I had hoped, naively, stupidly hoped, that she would have a way out, that there would be some loophole, some option to save her from the inevitable. But the truth was simple. She had signed her name on the mortgage, and the bank didn't care about family betrayals. She had put up her house as collateral for Trevor's debts, and with him unable, or more accurately, unwilling, to make the payments, the foreclosure notice arrived faster than any of us had expected. She called me in tears the day she got the final notice, her voice shaking, no longer the woman who had laughed at my humiliation, No longer the mother who had dismissed my anger as an overreaction. Now, she was a woman who had lost everything. "Ethan, I don't know what to do," she sobbed into the phone. "They're taking the house. My house. My home." A part of me wanted to feel sympathy, to rush in and fix it, to save her from the consequences of the choices she had made. But another part of me, the part that had been mocked, belittled, exploited, knew this was the price of blind loyalty to a man who had never deserved it. "I told you what Trevor was," I said, my voice steadier than I expected. "I told you, and you laughed." "I didn't know, Ethan. I didn't." "You didn't want to know." Silence. For the first time in my life, she had nothing to say. As my mother struggled to process the reality of what she had lost, the rest of the family started waking up to their own betrayals. My Uncle David, after realizing the loan he had co-signed was now his responsibility, filed fraud charges against Trevor. My cousin Andrew, furious over being manipulated into handing over thousands, followed suit. Aunt Linda? She wasn't just suing him. She was pressing criminal charges for forging her signature on a financial document she had never even seen. Trevor had spent years leeching off every person in our family, and now that they finally saw him for what he really was, they wanted blood. And then, there was Melanie. For so long, she had been Trevor's biggest defender, the one who made excuses, who called me dramatic, who insisted that her husband wasn't as bad as I made him out to be. But now, she was faced with a truth she couldn't ignore. I don't know what finally did it for her. Maybe it was seeing our mother lose her home. Maybe it was realizing just how deep the deception ran. Maybe it was hearing our relatives talk about the lawsuits, the fraud charges, the real possibility that Trevor was going to prison. Or maybe it was just looking at the man she had married and realizing that everything she had believed about him was a lie. She showed up at my door one night, her face pale, her eyes red-rimmed from crying. For the first time in years, she wasn't angry, wasn't defensive, wasn't looking at me like I was the problem. "I didn't know," she whispered. I looked at her, standing there, broken and lost, and I felt nothing but exhaustion. "I know," I said, and then I closed the door. The moment I handed over everything to my lawyer, I knew Trevor's days as a free man were numbered. The lawsuits were stacking up, the fraud reports were being processed, and the full weight of the law was closing in on him. But I also knew Trevor. He wasn't the type to sit around and face the consequences of his actions. He had spent his entire life running from responsibility, from debt, from every problem he had ever created. And when a man like that has nowhere left to hide, he does the only thing he knows how to do. He runs. It didn't take long for me to find out. A few days after Melanie showed up at my door, I got a call from my lawyer, his voice laced with grim amusement. "You're not going to believe this," he said. I already knew I would. Trevor tried to flee the country. I exhaled slowly, rubbing a hand down my face. Of course he did. Where was he going? Mexico, apparently. He booked a one-way ticket to Cancun, showed up at the airport with a duffel bag full of cash, a lot of cash, more than what we even thought he had left. TSA flagged him for carrying an unusually large amount of undeclared currency. When they ran his name, well, let's just say there were a few outstanding warrants that got him a one-way ticket to county jail instead. I closed my eyes for a moment, letting it sink in. Trevor, who had spent years conning everyone around him, had finally gotten caught trying to escape like a coward. But the story didn't end there. The authorities didn't just arrest him, they started digging. And what they found made everything I had uncovered look like pocket change. Trevor hadn't just been scamming me. He hadn't just been borrowing money from family, forging documents, or illegally renting out my property. He had been running scams on complete strangers. My lawyer sent me a news article that was already making the rounds. Trevor had been involved in multiple identity theft cases, some of which had nothing to do with our family. He had stolen from people he had met online, people he had worked with, even some small businesses that had unknowingly trusted him with their accounts. The duffel bag of cash he had been carrying? It wasn't just from our family's money. It was from a much bigger operation. And now, with all of his crimes coming to light, he wasn't just facing lawsuits. He was facing prison. For years, Trevor had laughed in my face, humiliated me in front of my family, spent my money like it was his, and manipulated everyone around him. He had been so sure he would never face consequences, that I would always clean up his mess, that my success meant he could do whatever he wanted without fear. But now, he wasn't laughing anymore. Now, he was in handcuffs. And as I read through the news reports, the witness statements, the details of his financial crimes, I felt nothing but satisfaction. For the first time in my life, Trevor couldn't run from what he had done, and I would never have to hear his name again. Trevor's trial didn't take long. With a mountain of evidence against him, fraud, identity theft, financial manipulation, forgery, and attempted flight from prosecution. His lawyer barely had a leg to stand on. He took a plea deal to avoid a longer sentence, but even that wasn't enough to save him from 15 years in prison. I sat in the courtroom the day they read his sentence. He didn't look at me, didn't even glance in my direction. His once smug arrogance had been replaced by hollow exhaustion, and for the first time in his miserable life, he looked like a man who understood that he had lost. The moment the judge finalized his fate, Trevor was escorted away, hands cuffed behind his back, head bowed in defeat. It was over. For the first time in years, I was free. But that freedom came at a cost. My mother tried to reach out after she lost her house, after Trevor's crimes became public, after she had no choice but to finally acknowledge what he had done. She called me, sent messages, even showed up at my office once, but I never responded. She had made her choice a long time ago, when she laughed at my humiliation, when she dismissed my anger as overreacting, when she willingly handed over her own home to the man who had been draining me dry for years. She had chosen Trevor over me, and now that he was gone, she expected me to step in and fix what was left of her life. I didn't. My sister Melanie wasn't much better. She had finally accepted the truth about her husband, but only when it was too late to matter. The day after his sentencing, she sent me a long-winded text about how she never really knew who he was and how she hoped we could find a way back to being a family. I didn't respond. There was nothing left to salvage. For years, I had given everything to people who never respected me. I had paid their debts, forgiven their betrayals, and let their mockery slide, all because I thought that's what family did. But the truth was, I had never been their family. I had been a resource, a safety net, a bank, and now, the bank was permanently closed. I moved on. Mila and I spent the next year rebuilding, not just financially, but emotionally. She had stood by me through everything, had been the one person who had never doubted me, never used me, never laughed at my pain. So, when I proposed to her, I knew exactly where I wanted to do it. The vacation home. My vacation home. The one Trevor had used as his personal income stream. The one he had rented out behind my back. The one he had turned into yet another symbol of his greed. I had spent months gutting it, restoring it, making it mine again. When Mila and I stood on the deck overlooking the lake, the sun setting in the distance, I got down on one knee and asked her to spend the rest of her life with me. She said yes. A year later, we got married in that same house. No family. No mother who had betrayed me. No sister who had refused to see the truth. No cousins who had laughed along with my humiliation. Just close friends, the people who actually cared about me, the people who had proven themselves when I needed them the most. And as I stood there, looking at the life I had built, the life I had reclaimed, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Peace. Trevor was gone. My past was behind me. And for the first time in my life, I belonged to myself.